Hello. Welcome everyone. Firstly, thank you for joining us for another Beyond webinar. My name is Steve Willoughby and I manage the technical transformation and digital team here in Wellington. And it's my pleasure to have James Fuller from Hnry along to present to us today. Look, I've known James for coming up 2 years now, and I found him very insightful, and he talks with an enormous amount of passion. We are going to talk today about permanent fixed-term contract and contracting, and due to COVID, the current employment market is changing rapidly. We now have career-long contractors looking at permanent and fixed-term work, and we have permanent people who have been made redundant now looking at contract options. So people are now considering things they wouldn't have considered 6 months ago. So James is going to offer his insights as to the differences between permanent, FTC and contract, look forward to his insights. Now, before I hand over to James, there will be an opportunity to ask questions throughout the webinar. We'll present a few of them to James at the end, and we hopefully will have this wrapped up within 45 to 60 minutes. So thank you again, and over to James.
Fantastic. Thanks, Steve. And just a big thank you to the team here at Beyond Recruitment for having me over. As Steve says, I'm always keen to talk about these kind of subjects, particularly given our role as Hnry in terms of what we do with the contracting workforce. Really, a lot of the stuff that we see on a day-to-day basis is super relevant when it comes to helping people make choices between contract, perm, and fixed term. So today we're going to keep the agenda quite rapid. I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these areas around permanent contract and fixed term. And then I really want to talk a little bit about what the future looks like. So as Steve mentioned, in the wake of COVID, there are a number of changes to the employment market. And I think there's some really exciting stuff that's going on that impacts individuals as well as organizations. So just as a starting point, I think running through each of these, and I'll flick on this first slide here, I wanted to talk about the changing nature of permanent work. So salaried employment has always been a very stable choice, seen as being a very consistent way of earning an income. Most organizations will look to invest heavily in their salaried staff that might provide career progression, opportunities for training. That's all kind of fairly standard from a salaried employment perspective. But it's worth noting that salaried employment is often called permanent work, whereas actually I think what we've seen particularly of late is that the permanent element of this kind of work is not necessarily always guaranteed. So over the last few years, we've seen a number of large organizations go through restructures and shifting people in and out of an organization. And it kind of calls into question the permanent nature of some of this work as a whole. So large organizations are sort of not in a position where they necessarily put forward permanence as being a real kind of differentiator for these roles. And actually organizations invest more knowing that people might only be in that organization for maybe 2.5, 3 years before they tend to move on. We saw that a lot in COVID. Obviously, there was a number of organizations at the start of COVID that looked to make structural changes to their organization. A number of organizations that maybe had a huge growth in permanent staff recently were not able to support them. And so we saw a lot of restructures just to kind of cater for the fact that COVID changed everything in the way people resourced. And there was a great quote from one of the Victoria University professors when they talked about the businesses that were sort of restructuring people, and the way he put it was really insightful. He said, well, if you'd have gone and bought a piece of equipment, a fixed asset, and that cost you, I don't know, let's say $1 million, and it's supposed to last 10 years. That's a little bit like the relationship that some employers will have with their salaried staff. They bring a staff member in with the expectation of investing in them for around 10 years, and let's just say that might equate to around $1 million worth of value. However, if you, for some reason, needed to have that piece of equipment, that fixed asset, have that unavailable for 8 weeks, let's say, it needed to be down for maintenance for 8 weeks out of 10 years, would you instantly remove that asset from your business? Would you sell it off? Would you get rid of it, knowing that in 8 weeks' time you would probably need it back again? And he used that as a great example of where some organizations had perhaps been very quick to restructure people out of an organization, when actually taking the hit of 8 weeks of someone being down for maintenance effectively could just be part of the life cycle of that member of staff. So it's a really interesting comparison to think about when you look at how organizations have been resourcing this kind of sort of boom and bust of bringing on a large number of permanent staff and then restructuring at certain points to sort of move people away from salaried employment. And actually, it's a really interesting sort of cycle that goes on, particularly in things like sort of telcos and banks, of the constant shift of an organization, meaning that, as we said before, permanent work may not be so permanent. And I think, what we're also seeing is that people and individuals are changing the way that they think about salaried employment. And, those of you out there who've been in salaried employment at the same employer for a couple of years might be wondering whether staying at that employer is a good long-term choice. Being with the same employer for many, many years on end perhaps doesn't have the same cachet that it used to a number of years ago. It's sort of a lot of people when they apply for jobs, it's no longer seen as a fantastic thing to have been at the same employer for 10, 15 years. And there tend to be questions about, what progressed during those 15 years, how did you evolve over those many years with the same employer? Whereas I think sort of 15, 20, even 25 years ago, showing that loyalty of staying with a single employer for a consistent amount of time was seen as being a really valuable asset for an individual. So what we're seeing is that people are starting to stay in salaried employment for maybe sort of 18 to 24 months with one employer before potentially moving on to something else. So from a duration perspective, it's really not that dissimilar from fixed term or contract work, in that, the idea that someone would stay somewhere for 15 years now is a little less common than it used to be. Particularly if we think about sort of government agencies and others, there's a lot of movement of labour between those agencies, a lot of people spending a few years at one agency and then moving to another, with particularly sort of the idea of staying there for your entire career being far less common. I remember doing some work at one of the agencies, probably about 5 or 6 years ago now, and I came across a guy who had been with that agency since they graduated high school. And the other people around him in the agency found that astonishing, that someone could have been 30 years in the same agency. And certainly the younger generation were sort of looking at this guy like, how come you haven't moved on? How come you haven't done something else? Whereas for that individual, that was a mark of honor. That was a mark of pride. But I think these days we're seeing people come out of tertiary education with a slightly different view on what career progression looks like. And individuals want more breadth of experience. They want more diversity of career options. And so staying long term in a single employment relationship doesn't have the same appeal. People coming into the world of work at the moment have very specific ideals about what they want work to look like. And it's very rare to find someone who actually says, you know what, I just want to work for one employer. A lot of people are looking to shift much more often. So moving on to talk about sort of contracting as a concept. Contracting itself is changing significantly and has changed significantly over the last 10 years or so. And I remember when I first started contracting, the people around me who were more often than not people who were in salaried employment would often view it with a certain sense of pessimism or risk. It was always almost met with a certain sense of surprise and sometimes pity, which I found a really interesting thing. You go to a barbecue and you would say to people that you were contracting, and people would say things like, "Oh, that must be tough," or "How do you deal with that?" Because there was a certain perception that being a contractor was somehow kind of less stable or less consistent than the sort of so-called permanent work that other people would be doing. But really, it's not been the case for a while when it comes to contracting that it has had that sense of inconsistency. It's become far more of a sort of certain way of earning income, and there are options. There are many options available to sort of help people get ahead with contracting. And I know that when we look at the recruitment market, contracting is a very buoyant part of recruitment. So it's less of a sort of fringe way of earning income. And for me, I always look to the kind of government statistics as a way of benchmarking the sort of the normalization of contracting. And I think across government agencies, the latest figures from the State Services Commission, I think last year, was that they're spending in excess of $900 million a year on contractors, consultants, and sort of non-salaried staff. And this has been the same. This is not a new thing for government, particularly to leverage external labour. It's something that actually has been very, very consistent. And I think there are a number of people who are, who have emerged out of salaried employment, who are taking on contracts, who are now quite comfortable with that as being their primary source of income. And sort of broader than just sort of what we would call contracting work, over 20% of Kiwis currently earn some or all of their income outside of salaried employment, which is really fascinating when you think about the widespread nature of people earning what we would call an independent income. So what we see is that contracting is a core part of not just government but private sector. There is always a lot of work on for those people who have the right skills. And many people, as I say, who go into contract roles don't feel the need to sort of jump back into perm or to sort of to look for salaried options, because actually there is sufficient work out there. Notwithstanding, after COVID, people are sort of looking at their employment options. I think that we should be encouraging people to look at the most diverse range of options that are available to them. So it's not really the case these days that you either have to be a salaried employee or you earn some form of independent income. More and more we're seeing people kind of mix between the two. And just as a sort of as an aside, I always find the term contractor to be like a really interesting choice, because we're sort of pigeonholing people by the duration of the time they spend with a particular client. And I always use the example that if someone was only working for a client for maybe a handful of weeks, like 3 weeks, we would probably call them an external consultant. We probably wouldn't call them a contractor per se. If they were only working a few days a week, we would probably call them a freelancer. And really, we've kind of, over the last however many years, we've developed this vernacular, this way of describing people that sort of kind of pigeonholes people into certain groups based on how long they work for a particular client. And so, we'll talk a little bit later about, what we would call people who are earning independently, these sort of independent earners, and how we need to think a little bit differently about how we describe that. But certainly, most of the way that these people are defined is that they're working for one or many clients concurrently for short to medium term periods of time. But I think naturally we've just assumed this term contractor as it's a sort of nice bucket to put people into. But certainly it's a growing trend and something we're seeing more and more people take advantage of out there in the market. So moving on to talk a little bit about fixed term. It sort of used to be the case that a lot of organisations would offer a fixed term option to individuals because they almost didn't want to burden that individual with the sorts of sort of financial admin and hassles that used to be the case if you were a contractor. So what they would do is to say, well, look, we only need someone into this organisation for a period of 6 months. That might be for, say, maternity or maternity or paternity cover, so parental leave. It might be to fill a particular skill gap. And what the organisation would do is to say, well, we can provide a fixed-term contract for a period of time, which was, at the time would have been an attractive prospect for people. But what is sort of in doing so, what organisations did was kind of create this kind of strange class of employee that was neither a sort of salaried member of staff nor a contractor. So ending up in this kind of halfway house. They're not going to be invested in like a full-time salaried member of staff in terms of training and development because there is a fixed end date to their employment. And they're not able to get access to maybe the same resources that would be afforded to a permanently employed staff member. Things like KiwiSaver were rarely included for fixed-term contractors, and you might get sort of holiday pay or sick pay prorated, but it was very much it was an interim, a stopgap. It's very rare to find people who would say that they consistently only did fixed-term contracts. More often than not, you would have a traditional contractor who maybe wanted to take on a particular role and would say, okay, I'm comfortable taking a fixed term contract for this particular engagement, but once that finishes, I will go back to being a sort of traditional contractor. And vice versa, for people in salaried roles, they might be between salaried roles. They might see something and say, I will pick up that fixed term contract, with the idea being that I might be able to get a more permanent salaried role at this employer down the line, or even transition to a different mode of working. So fixed term is sort of a very strange kind of in between, and that means that fixed term staff find it difficult to engage with organisations because they know that there's a certain end point to their tenure. And a lot of the time, when organisations bring these people on, it tends to be that certain endpoint that really guides how they deal with them. And so there's a bunch of grey area where organisations perhaps would be better off hiring a salaried member of staff, or actually looking to bring someone in from a contract perspective. But the fixed term contract is more of something that is sort of offered out for those people that are comfortable with it. And what we're seeing is that a lot of people who previously would have been more comfortable with fixed term because contracting seemed a bit scary, are now saying, well, actually contracting doesn't seem so scary anymore. It is so commonplace. There are ways of being really, really effective as a contractor. Actually, fixed term is just becoming less and less relevant for people on kind of either end of that spectrum. One of the big things that I was found about fixed term work was, even though you are a temporary member of staff and you might not get access to the same benefits and amenities as more salaried members of staff are, you kind of have the sort of almost the worst of both worlds in some respects. Is that you are not a salaried member of staff on a permanent basis. You don't necessarily have that job security because there's a fixed end date, but then you also you're not able to take advantage of the benefits of being an independent earner. You're not able to claim business expenses relevant to what you're doing. You're not able to kind of necessarily earn income alongside some of that fixed term work. Some fixed term contracts have quite tightly bound contract terms. And so what we see is a sort of state where people would like to have the opportunity to go contracting, but kind of feel like they're not getting that benefit. They're getting the sort of the temporal, the short-term nature of being a sort of temporary staff member somewhere to gain experience, but they're not actually able to get the full benefit of being a contractor, an independent earner. And so again, there's a number of shifts in the market where we're seeing fixed term for a lot of people be a sort of strange halfway house that they're not as interested in pursuing. So, it's worth noting that, for a large number of people and large number of organizations, the choice to offer fixed term tends to come from less of a knowledge of the open options. Usually a lot of organizations will say either someone can be a salaried member of staff or they can be fixed term. However, what we're starting to see is organizations get a bit more comfortable with offering contracts. Could be part-time, it could be on a freelance basis. And we'll talk a little bit now about kind of what the future looks like, given some of these changes that we're seeing and some of the changing attitudes to different modes of working. So what we've seen, and again, particularly in light of COVID, it's sort of been one of the biggest changes to the way people earn for a significant period of time. We're seeing people start to sort of almost de-risk their earning by earning from different sources. And so just to sort of to delve into a bit of that, we're seeing people who are looking to earn both salaried employment as well as some sideline income. Now that might be doing some contracting, freelancing, consulting on the side, to sort of de-risk, almost putting all your eggs in one basket, having one single employer where your ongoing income depends on the financial stability of one single organization. And particularly during COVID, as Steve mentioned in his intro, a lot of people were unfortunately made redundant and are now looking at their options in front of them saying, well, for the last however many years, I've been reliant on a single organization at a time in order to earn income. in the future, perhaps I should look to sort of de-risk the way that I earn and look at opportunities to earn concurrently off multiple clients, or maybe look at sort of more frequent, shorter term work as a way of not necessarily having to rely on just one organization for all of their income. So people are now sort of looking at things and saying, well, actually, it has never been easier to go between permanent and contract and then back again. Certainly a lot of, we find a lot of clients of Hnry do exactly this. They will come out of perm work, they'll go and do a contract role for 6 months, and then they have the option, if they want to go back into perm, they can do so these days without having a whole bunch of sort of financial hassle and tax follow them back into perm work. And so we see people do this all the time, and it's kind of blurring the lines a little bit between this idea of salaried employment and contract. They're not this mutually exclusive thing that says, well, either I'm a salaried employee or I'm a contractor. People are actually starting to look at, well, what are the opportunities that are in front of me? What is the work that I want to get, that I want to do? And they're baking in these different working styles into their career path. So that your career path is not necessarily just tied to one mode of working. It's more about the skills you collect along the way, the experiences that you can bring to organizations. And so, you know, people are looking to sort of diversify the way that they earn, which is really, really exciting for individuals, because it puts the power back in the hand of the individual as to where they focus their career. And there's a concept that we talk a lot about at Hnry, which is called having a portfolio career, which is kind of like having a sort of investment portfolio. If you think about your kind of range of investments, some will be more relevant and be more in demand than others at different times. And so when you have a portfolio career, you're effectively dialing up and down your different skills at different times based on what the demands of the market are. You might be, you know, investing in sort of stable skills, or you might be looking at skills that are in a sort of growth mode, skills that are a little rarer at this point, where the payoff might be greater. You might be able to command higher pay rates for having those. And it's a really interesting, when we think about it, it's a concept that is not really that new. And I think a lot of you out there would be in this situation that I was, where you're applying for salary jobs, and sort of, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, applying for salary jobs, and I would have multiple versions of my CV. If I was applying for a project management role, I would accentuate my project management skills. If it was about agile or business analysis, I would accentuate those skills. And that was me effectively using my portfolio of skills to make myself the most saleable possible. So what we're seeing is that actually people are already embracing this idea of having a portfolio career. They're less wedded to a job title as being the be all and end all. You know, it's rarely that we see these days someone say, well, I'm a lifetime BA and I will not consider any other role either side of that. What we tend to see is people say, well, actually I have BA project management experience, I have some agile, I have some waterfall, and we're seeing people actually use their skills as the way that they earn, as opposed to be defined by sort of a single job title. And you know, you look at the development of that and you say, well, once you've got to that stage where you do have that flexibility, you're in a much better position to actually kind of drop this moniker of either being salary or contract or even fixed term, and you say, well, actually, what are the skills that I want to invest my time in at the moment? What's the kind of work that I want to do? And actually be a bit more comfortable that moving between those different types of employment is far more available to people these days than I think it ever has been. And so, you know, the upshot of that is actually we start to see from an organization perspective that organizations are getting more comfortable with kind of flexible resourcing. And so I think for many years, organizations have either been sort of one thing or the other. Either they employ salaried staff or they employ contractors. But I think one of the perils of that is that I remember when I used to work in consulting, we would always have a problem where a big piece of work would come up. We would go out and hire a whole bunch of fresh people to come into the organization on salary roles. But maybe after 12 months or so, those projects would end, and we would have to look around and say, well, where are we going to deploy these resources next? Where in the business can we put these people? Because we have them now, they're inside the organization. But I think what we're seeing now is organizations are saying, well, actually, perhaps in the past, we've been solving short-term problems with long-term solutions. We've been bringing in people who are going to be in our organization for 12, 24, 36 months, who actually could have been far better utilized for a 6-month contract, for example. And I always liken this to if you were to go out and buy some software, you go and buy some SaaS software. And if I need to add extra users to that software, I could just log in and just say, I'd like 10 more users. I want 50 more users. And it's basically allowing you to scale that product as your business grows. No longer are we at this default position of like, when I need to go and get software, I have to go and buy a whole bunch of servers and I have to put it into my office and I have to maintain them and they depreciate over time. Actually, software has got to a stage where it flexes with my business. And I think we're starting to see organizations take that same approach to resourcing and say, okay, there will always be a core of salaried staff and permanent people that exist in our organization, but how do we supplement them for scale? How do we use more flexible resourcing models to actually scale up and down as the demands of the market dictate it, which is actually really exciting for individuals, because it then allows those individuals to say, well, how do I best take advantage of this? If I'm not necessarily going to be wedded to a single employer for a significant number of years, I can go and build new skills. I can go and work for different people. I can actually bring kind of diversity of experience to the table everywhere I go. And so there's almost this perfect storm of individuals are embracing the idea of more flexible working, and organizations are realizing that actually perhaps resourcing up to hundreds and hundreds of permanent staff and then going through a restructure potentially isn't the best use of time and resources on a regular basis. And so organizations are starting to sort of almost develop a kind of trusted pool of contractors, freelancers, and external resources that they can call on to provide scale into their business. And I do genuinely use ourselves as a good example of this. So at Hnry, we have, I think, like 17 full-time staff now, but there are a number of things that we need to scale up and down at certain times that we look to the contractor freelance market for. And we have a trusted pool of freelance writers, we have people who do the mobile app development, we have graphic designers, videographers. We don't have enough work for them full time, and genuinely these people would not work for us full time because they want to have that diversity of experience. And so what we have is this kind of growing pool of freelance talent, effectively, that we can bring in when we need significant amounts of, whether it's animations done or mobile app work. We can bring these people in for periods of time. We can have them on retainer for a few days a week, and they get the benefit of working for multiple clients, and we get the benefit of having really high quality freelance and contract labor that we can scale with our business as and when we need it, which is just, for us, is a much smarter way of resourcing. And small businesses have been doing this for a number of years, but now we're starting to see larger organizations take this approach, and government agencies say, well, now that contracting isn't as risky and it's not as taboo as it used to be, how do we actually embrace what we're calling dynamic resourcing and look at blended workforces as a positive way of keeping the business sustainable and also deploying the right talent when it's required? So, I mean, finally, the last thing to sort of touch on before I throw it open for a few questions is really around the changing nature of how we work. So in the wake of COVID, obviously, we've all got used to working remotely. This session itself, which I think prior to COVID would probably have been an in-person session, this is now being delivered online. And we've all become comfortable with probably about 8 different video conference softwares and which ones we like and which ones we don't. But at a wider scale, effectively, COVID has accelerated the move towards remote working. Those organizations that would have never let people work from home previously were absolutely forced to accommodate an entire workforce working from their homes. And whilst this is a fantastic thing for individuals because we can all have a bit more flexibility about how we work, this is also a really interesting thing when we think about employment. So now we're in a world where we can work for anyone from anywhere. We can work flexibly, we can work remotely. Not all organizations are requiring people to be physically present inside an office. It's no longer about applying for jobs in your city or even your country. And great examples of this, and again, for some industries, this is nothing new. We have some people using Hnry who they live in Dunedin and they are maintaining servers for companies in Silicon Valley. And again, nothing new. This has been going on for years. But what COVID has done is normalize this way of working, so that actually there's a base expectation for people going into jobs that they should be able to work remotely. They should have time to be sort of more flexible with their working hours. And coupled with the changing nature of the types of work and sort of how we actually go and earn and who we work for, basically we're significantly changing the way that we actually go and earn income in total. So I always joke, my kind of pet peeve is people talking about the future of work, because I always find that the future of work implies that there's this distant thing that at one point one day will come around and we'll all go, oh wow, the future of work has finally arrived. A bit like those sort of programs many years ago that would sort of try and predict the future, and we look at them now and we laugh about the fact of how wrong they were. But I always look at it and say, look, this talk of the future of work is completely irrelevant. The fact is, all of this stuff is here now. All the stuff we've been talking about in terms of flexible working, remote working, organizations using dynamic pools of resources. We've seen this happen in industries for years. You look at the film and TV industry, for instance, that is all freelance contract labor, because they don't know when a particular production is going to run late. They can't have people just sat around on staff. That whole industry flexes based on demand. All we're seeing now is that we're seeing more traditional industries and organizations, and even more traditional individuals, start to cotton onto the fact that actually this is all possible. This is all possible with the technology we have, with the working environments we have. And that's a really exciting thing, is so that people can actually have more control over how and for whom they earn their income. And so, for us, it's a very exciting time. I think it's never been easier to be in sort of a blended mode of perm or fixed term or contract. And it's about being able to choose what's right for you and what's right for you at the time, rather than kind of being pigeonholed into one of those three. That's sort of all I had from me. And I know we hopefully have some questions, Steve, that might have been coming through.
Yeah, g'day. Thanks, James. One comment you mentioned is people doing video interviews as opposed to face-to-face, and being in the industry, I've found that most clients are now very open to video interviewing, even for people located in Wellington. Just yesterday, I assumed that the client would want to see the person face-to-face, but were offered up the choice of having a video interview.
It's fascinating, because actually, just on that point, we've got our technical team, our engineering team this morning are running speed interviews for the Summer of Tech, and they're all being done online. So we have, this morning, they're interviewing 21 candidates in 4 hours in speed interviews. And that whole process has all moved online in the wake of COVID. It previously would have been in person. But actually, the team is really, really enjoying it, because actually they can speak to a whole bunch of people. They get dedicated slots with everyone, but also it's about condensing that into a shorter period of time. So yeah, it's certainly become commonplace, I think, in a lot of areas.
Cool. Now I'm going to combine two questions. We've got quite a few sitting there. So the first question is, what's the attitude of employers about those who have done contracts, and then when it comes to perm, are they suspicious? Once in a permanent role, they will bail at the first contract opportunity, which kind of ties into how often is too often to be switching between perm, fixed term contract and contract before it starts to impact your CV.
Oh, interesting. I'll answer the second part of that one first, which is how often is too often. I think, if someone is, the kind of changing way we structure our CVs, if someone is going in between contracts or in between roles, it's really important to actually have that on your CV as to whether or not that was a salaried role or whether that was a contract or a fixed term. I think all too often we don't actually put that down on our CV. We don't make it clear the contract terms that we were under. And I think, just as an aside, and I'm guilty of it myself, I do think we have to drop this term permanent work, because I think, number one, it implies something back to the individual, that somehow there is some sort of never-ending tenure with this client. But actually, when we talk about, as individuals, presenting ourselves to potential employers, we should be saying this was salary, this was a fixed term, or this was actually on a contract basis. So how often is too often? I think from an employer's point of view, if you are jumping around between salaried roles every 6 months, that will start to seem a little bit strange. The employer will still want to invest in you. They'll still want to get at least 2 years worth of value. If you're moving on within 12 to 18 months, that's absolutely understandable, but it's more about your reasons for doing so. If on the other hand, you are doing a blend of salary and contract role, and you do, 6 months in a contract role, and then you go into a more permanent arrangement, it's more about you being able to have that conversation with the potential employer about your reasonings for doing so. And actually, I always find that when people come to us at Hnry and they talk about their reasons for going between the two, usually it's not because they're just looking for that next step. It's because an opportunity came up that they couldn't pass up. It was a specific project that was on a salary basis that they were really excited about doing at a particular organization. But when that project finished up, they were in that position that I used to get to, where you get dropped back into the regular rotation. You have to find something else to do. And most employers will be quite comfortable with you saying, hey, look, I achieved what I wanted to achieve here. I'm going to move on. So I don't think it's as cut and dried in saying there is a set time limit of how long you need to stay with people, but it's more about making it really clear what your reasons for moving between different clients are. And if you go between salary and contract, that's not a bad thing. That doesn't have stigma. It's more about being able to talk to your reasons for doing so.
Cool, thank you, James. A couple more, and again, I'm going to combine a couple because they're quite similar. So I've got someone here, for those contractors who have a New Zealand registered business and took on a fixed term contract for a while, can expenses during the fixed term contract still be charged as a business expense? Is there always fixed expenses in a business that will continue regardless? So, I mean, the bigger question there is what are the big tax or compliance differences between, or that people need to know when it comes to perm, FTC and contract?
So I think, for fixed term contracts, again, dependent on contract terms, and obviously they're all slightly different, but the majority of fixed term contracts that we've seen, people are coming in on a salary basis, and it's the individual being employed. So in that case, if you imagine that you're an individual being employed on a salary basis with an organisation, if you do a fixed term contract for them, you're usually on some sort of prorated salary arrangement, and that is you as the individual. So I think the question there was sort of touched on, if you have a registered company, the company is not the entity that is being engaged in the fixed term contract. And so if you think about business expenses, the only thing that I think will be specifically relevant for that company is if you are actively engaging in some form of business development for that company in order for that company to earn an income. And those are usually sort of the IRD rules, is if you are out there looking to win work as that company, you're looking to line up a pipeline of work, you are actively on behalf of that company looking to earn income, then there will be expenses that can be claimed. However, if you, as the director of that company, happen to take on a fixed term, effectively sort of pro rata salary contract somewhere, it is you as the individual that is being engaged and not the company. And so from a sort of employment perspective, as far as IRD are concerned, it's the same rules that apply if you're a PAYE earner, in so much that there is not a sort of self-employed nature of being in a fixed term contract. But I think it's a really good question for people to really think about when they're talking to employers, when they're talking to clients, if you are entering into fixed term contracts, to be really clear about what that means for you, whether there are tax implications, if you have been contracting before, whether or not that does mean that you're not in a position to claim any further business expenses. And actually, the costs of sort of salaried staff versus contract staff, if you start to weigh up KiwiSaver contributions, holiday pay, etc., the rates for contractors, whilst they might seem slightly higher, are usually just taking into account those kind of benefits that you're not getting as a contract member of staff. So if you go to an employer and say, actually, rather than a fixed term contract, can I negotiate an actual an independent contract? A lot of employers will actually say, okay, but let's have the conversation. They won't say no at that point, because what they want is actually the short-term nature of your engagement. I don't think a lot of them are really that worried about whether it's fixed term. If you're willing to offer that on a contract basis, I think it actually probably reduces a lot of their admin overhead, and in that position, you'd still be able to continue to claim business expenses as before.
Another question, coming through thick and fast. What would be the contractual constraints for someone to concurrently work in a fixed term contract for one organisation or doing freelance contract for another?
It totally depends on your industry. So fixed term contracts, again, contract pending, everyone would have a decent look at your contract. It kind of comes down to the exclusivity of that contract and whether or not you're on a fixed term contract where the employer has explicitly said that you may not work for anyone else in the same industry. So, if you look at it from a broader perspective, if you are a salary earner there is probably something in your contract that forbids you from working for another company full-time concurrently, probably forbids you from working for another competitor company at the same time. But if you're a salaried earner, there is nothing to stop you going out and earning an income independently in your spare time, in those hours that you're not required to be at your employer. And so a fixed term contract will probably have the same provisions. And we see this a lot where people will have a full-time, either fixed term or salaried contract, but in their evenings, they might be doing some work on something completely different. They might be selling crafts online or driving an Uber or doing photography at the weekends. And this, again, has been something that's very, very common, has been done for many years. And what's exciting now is we're seeing a lot of people whose side hustles are now taking over. They may be, with the changes of COVID, they're saying, actually, do you know what? I'm now in an opportunity where the contract market is really coming alive, or the freelance market is coming alive. I'm going to spend more time doing my side hustle work than I am doing my salaried employment. And we're seeing people go back to their employers and say, I would like to reduce my hours per week and do a pro rata 3 or 4 day week. And some employers are actually quite pleased to be able to have that cost reduction. And then people are spending 2 days working on something completely different. So again, it comes down to your contract terms, but there's nothing to say that you can't earn income independently alongside fixed term or salaried employment.
Nice one. Longer one here. Hi, James. I've been contracting for a number of years now, more by chance than design, as I'm always seeking permanent work. But the more I contracted, the more I gained more contracts. What are your thoughts on long-term financial stability? We would like to buy our own house, for example, but my track record as a contractor looks like too much risk for lenders.
Oh, great question. I had exactly this challenge when I was contracting, where and this is, not to sort of sideswipe the question, but I think this is a problem with lenders. And this isn't a problem with people going contracting. And a lot of the work that we do, and we work a lot with ASB, is about educating lenders as to what independent earning looks like, and trying to educate them as to actually this is not a kind of risk-filled profession. And if you take a macro lens to someone's earnings over sort of a decent period, and you say, actually, what is the consistency of income? It is usually just as consistent as anyone who's in salaried employment. And we had these conversations with a number of the banks where, for years, when you go for kind of financing for anything, they will ask you for, last 3 pay slips and a copy of your contract. And we say to the banks, that is no guarantee of ongoing income from this individual, because we know that with restructures, we know that with different things, there is no permanence to these jobs anymore. And actually, where you have someone who is either a career contractor or is earning self-employed income, there's almost more certainty, because they know that this person's entire income depends on them hustling for work, getting contracts, going out and earning. And so for me, it's, I don't think people should be effectively forced into taking salary jobs just because banks don't necessarily understand the self-employed market. So we've actually played quite a big advocacy role on behalf of the self-employed in New Zealand, and go and work directly with the banks to say, this is how self-employment works. It is not because you're a contractor, it might be risky. There's no such thing as lumpy income when you take a bit more of a zoomed out view. And we're starting to see, at least, ASB, who's our banking partner, really come to the table and understand how lending works. And genuinely, if anyone wants to speak to the mortgage team at ASB who absolutely understand contracting, my email address is up there. Literally no obligation. We don't get anything from this, but I just genuinely think that this team has really come to the party to understand how that works. And day in, day out, we get people come to us and say, how can I get a mortgage as a contractor? And I'm more than happy to help anyone by putting them in touch with that team.
Cool. Thank you, James. Just one last one before we wrap up. Before I get to the actual question, me as a recruiter over the last 10 years, I've seen naturally rates for contract assignments increase, and probably the length of the contract assignments increase over time. What have you seen? What have you seen since COVID? What significant changes to both rates and length have you seen?
It's actually been really interesting. I think when COVID started, we obviously, like everyone, just had a whole bunch of hypotheses about what would happen. I think overall, we've seen that actual rates have stayed relatively consistent, barring a few isolated organisations that sort of asked contractors to take a temporary rate cut, which some of the contractors were quite comfortable knowing that their income would be consistent, but they might have to cut their rates slightly. But overall, rates, particularly around government, have stayed consistent. We were sort of in a position where we thought perhaps the market will sort of right itself and come down, but certainly the rates have stayed consistent across public and private sector, which is very positive. But what we're seeing is contract terms are starting to shift slightly, in that I think the days of having a 12-month contract guaranteed on the table may be sort of going away slightly, and actually people are saying, well, let's take it on a 6-month rolling basis. Let's do 6-month contracts with the option to extend. And so it's less about the overall contract itself and the duration changing. It's more about organizations and individuals seeing that opportunity for flexibility and saying, well, how do we make sure that neither party is getting locked in? And we're still seeing people who've been long-term contractors for a few years in particular organizations still getting extended. And it's a very consistent market, and it has been for a long time, even with the sort of upcoming elections. And there's always concerns with any even potential change in government or even change in certain people within administration that it might change. But there's actually a real sense of consistency about the overall kind of contract market around rates. And for those people who genuinely kind of invest in their networks and invest in their own skills, there is certainly a large amount of work still out there, for contractors for the long term.
Cool, thank you, James. There were a few questions that came in towards the end there. We won't address them now, but my contact details are on the Beyond website. I'm happy to answer the more recruitment-driven questions. So it's Steve Willoughby, and I think that's almost us. So James, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
I hope people out there got a feel for the passion that James speaks with. And yeah, thanks for your time. Cheers.
Thanks.